Hey guys, I am a day late with our lesson. I'm sorry. Let's see, last week we had talked about Samuel, and at the end of talking about Samuel, we had mentioned David, so I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into David on this lesson. And we'll start off, you're going to find these in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel when you're looking for them. Okay. All day long, David was out on the hills looking after his father's sheep. Sometimes one of them strayed, and he went after it and brought it back. Sometimes a hungry jackal, a bear, or a lion tried to carry one off for the flock. Then David needed all his strength and skill to beat the wild animal off and rescue the sheep. But most of the time, there was little or nothing to do except move the sheep on now and then to better pasture, a new place where the grass was thick and green. But David wasn't bored. He practiced with his sling until he was a good shot, and he played his harp, often singing songs he made up for himself. He began to get quite a name as a musician. People stopped to listen to this boy's playing. This boy's playing was something special. Meanwhile, there was trouble in the palace. King Saul was an unhappy man. Samuel never came to him these days. God was far away. Everything was going wrong. Saul's black moods came more and more often. Something had to be done. What the king needs is music. One of his servants said to calm him down and make him forget his troubles. I know this man, said another. And that was how David first came to the king's palace. His music worked better than any medicine. Saul's troubled mind was set at rest. Soon he was well again, and David was sent back home. News came that the Philistines, the old enemies of Israel, were marching north. They set up camp in the valley of Elah. The Philistine army was on one side of the valley. The Israelite army was on the other, and a little brook ran between them. The Philistines had a secret weapon. His name was Goliath, a great giant of a man, 10 feet tall. The shaft of his spear was as thick as a man's arm. Day after day, Goliath walked proudly to and fro, shouting and jeering. Where is the champion of Israel? Let him come out and fight me, if he dare. But no one did. They were all much too afraid. 3 of David's brothers were soldiers in Saul's army, and David was sent with food to see how they were. He arrived one day just in time to hear Goliath's threats. Who is this man, said David, to defy the armies of the living God? Let me go and fight him. The soldiers only laughed, but when Saul heard of it, he sent for David. You are just a boy, he said. What chance do you have against this great warrior? I have fought lions and bears that attacked the sheep, said David. God was with me then, and he will be with me now. Very well, said the king. Go, and God be with you. He gave David his sword and dressed him in his own armor, but David couldn't even walk in it. I can't fight with all this on, he said, and he looked it off. He took it off again. I might be able to read. He gave David his sword and dressed him in. I just read that. He picked up his shepherd's stick and his sling. He chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his bag. They went out to fight Goliath. When Goliath saw him coming, he laughed till his sides ached. Is this your champion? He cheered at the Israelites. But David said, Today God will give you into my hand, then everyone will know that there is a God in Israel. He took a stone from his bag and fitted it into his sling. The stone flew like a rocket. It hit Goliath on the forehead with such force it pierced his skull. David ran up to him, took Goliath's sword from its sheath, and cut off the giant's head. The Philistine army gave a great cry. Then they all turned and ran with the Israelites in hot pursuit. The battle was won. David's victory over Goliath made him famous. Saul took him to stay at the palace. He shall marry my daughter, the king said. Saul's son Jonathan took an instant liking to David. Soon they were firm friends. They pronounced one another they'd be friends forever, no matter what might happen. David joined the army and became a great soldier. He was very popular. The people sang his praises, and Saul grew jealous. David was engaged to Saul's daughter, Merab. But the king put off the wedding one day. As David sat playing his harp, Saul hurled a spear at him, and this was only the beginning of the trouble. Saul made Merab marry another man, breaking his promise to David. And when he heard that Michal, his youngest daughter, was in love with David, he saw his chance to get David killed. No need for a wedding gift, he said. All I want is 200 dead Philistines. It was a clever idea. Saul was sure the Philistines would kill David, but instead David and his men carried out the king's order, and David married Michal. Jonathan hated his plotting. He warned David that Saul was out to get him killed, and he pleaded with the king to change his mind and spare David. Saul agreed, but again he broke his word. As David was playing his harp one evening, Saul's spear whistled past his head and stuck quivering in the wall. Life in the palace was no longer safe. That night, Michal helped David escape by shining down a rope from the window of their house when the guards were not looking, and David said a very sad goodbye. They were never to meet again. From then on, David was an outlaw living in the hills. He gathered a band of men, and they moved from place to place, finding what food they could. Danger was never far away. Sometimes Saul's men were so close that escape seemed impossible. But God was still with David, keeping him safe till the time came for him to become a king. Once Saul came alone and unarmed to the entrance of the cave where David and his men were hiding. The king was at his mercy, but David refused to harm him. Several times people told the king where David was hiding, and Saul came to hunt him out. He camped near Ziph once with his army, and at dead of night David and 2 of his men crept past the guard to the place where Saul lay sleeping, with his spear stuck in the ground beside him. "Kill him now and in your troubles," whispered David's men. "God has given him to you." But David said, "I will never harm the man God chose as king. Let him die in God's own good time." No one saw them leave the camp, taking Saul's spear and water jar with them. When they were a good way off, David gave a great shout that woke the camp with a start. "Fine guards you are," he said. You should take better care of the king. Look, here is his spear." Saul knew that voice. It was David, and David had spared his life. Saul was ashamed that he had treated David so badly, and for a while he left him alone, but not for long. Nowhere in Israel was safe now, so David took refuge in the Philistine city of Ziklag. He pretended to be on the side of the Philistines. He was there when Philistines marched north to wage war on Israel. They camped near Shunem. A terrible battle took place on the mountain of Gilboa. Jonathan died that day with the rest of Saul's sons. The king was so badly wounded he fell on his own sword rather than be taken alive by the enemy. The next day, when they found him, the Philistines cut off his head and fastened his body to the wall at Bethshan. But brave men came and took it down and gave the king proper burial. The whole nation mourned. David was full of sorrow when he heard the news. He lifted his voice in a great lament. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death they were not divided. How are the mighty fallen in the midst of battle? And David cried until he could cry no more. Let's see. The trumpet sounded, the people gave a great shout. David is being crowned king of Israel. Long live King David. The days as an outlaw were over, but that was not the end of David's troubles. The followers of the old king Saul fought against him. The Philistines and other old enemies were always waiting to return, and at the heart of his kingdom, the fortress of Jerusalem was still held by a Canaanite tribe. It was a great day when David stormed the stronghold and made the city of Jerusalem his new capital. There was peace at last. Now David could do something he had wanted to do for a long time. He gave orders for the sacred box which held God's law to be brought to Jerusalem. What a day of singing and dancing and feasting that was. And King David outdanced them all. He was so full of joy. Now Jerusalem was more than his own capital city, it was the city of God. David was a good king, a great soldier, a born leader. He had many sons and daughters. All his people loved him. He did not grow proud and disobedient as King Saul had done. He remained loyal to God all his life. But there were times even so when things went badly wrong. One afternoon in spring, when his army was away fighting a tribe called the Ammonites, King David went on the flat roof of the palace where the air was cooler. Glancing down, he saw a woman he had never seen. "Who is that?" he asked. "Bathsheba, Uriah's wife," came the reply. Now Uriah was one of David's bravest soldiers, and he was away fighting the king's war, but David put all that out of his mind. He ordered his servants to bring Bathsheba to the palace, and he brought her to the palace, and I don't know how to word this. They done husbandly and wife things, but they were not husband and wife. A few weeks later, Bathsheba sent to tell the king she was going to have a baby, David's child. What would happen when Uriah, her husband, found out? David had to act quickly. He sent the order to his army commander, "Send Uriah to the front line and make sure he is killed." It was all done in secret. No one else knew, or so David thought, but he was forgetting about God. Uriah died. David married Bathsheba. The child, a boy, was born. David thought his secret would never be known. And then one day a man called Nathan, God's messenger, he was a prophet, came to the king with a story. "Once upon a time," he began, "there were two men, one very rich, the other very poor. The rich man owned great flocks and herds. The poor man had only one lamb. It was almost like one of the family. The rich man had a visitor and needed a lamb for a meal. But instead of killing one of his own flock, he took the poor man's lamb and killed it, cooked it, and gave it to his guests to eat." The story made David very angry indeed. How could anyone be so cruel? There was a long silence. Then Nathan spoke again, and his words were sharp as arrows. "You are the man," he said. "God made you king and gave you all you could wish for, yet you took Uriah's wife and sent him to his death. God saw it all. Don't think that just because you are king you can do things like that and get away with it. Because of your sin, the child will die." David was horrified and bitterly sorry for the wrong he had done, but he could not save the child's life. The boy died. David comforted Bathsheba, and God forgave him and gave them a second son. They called him Solomon. The king was busy and active. In the years that followed, he fought many battles and his kingdom grew strong. But he wanted more than anything to build a special house, a temple for God. However, this was not to be. "That is something for Solomon to do," God said. So David had to be content with drawing up the plans and storing up gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and precious stones ready for Solomon to start building. And he spent many hours arranging the temple's services, especially the music, for David loved music and wrote a great many hymns. Yes, David was certainly a great king, one of the greatest, but within his own family it was a different story. He could manage state affairs. He could not control his own sons. He paid dearly for his weakness. All the people loved the king's good-looking young son, Absalom. But being loved was not enough for him. Absalom had set his heart on becoming king. He plotted against his father and arranged a meeting at Hebron, where he was proclaimed king. Then he marched on the capital city, Jerusalem, and David was forced to run for his life. It was a civil war. Ahithophel and the wisest of all David's advisors went over to Absalom's side, and things looked black for the king. But God had not forgotten him. He loved David and had taken care of him all his life, and he was still looking after him. Hushai, David's trusted friend, pretended to side with Absalom when he was really sending secret information about Absalom's plans to the king instead of following David and taking him by surprise. As Absalom had advised, Absalom let Hushai persuade him to wait. This gave David the time he needed to gather this army. There was a terrible battle, and David's army won. Absalom escaped as fast as he could, but he rode his mule under a low, spreading tree and was caught in the branches. It caught his head in the branches. And there David's soldiers found him, and against the king's express orders to spare Absalom's life, they killed him. When David heard this news, he felt he could not bear it. "Oh, my son, my Absalom," he sobbed. "How I wish I had died instead of you." So that great day of victory ended in mourning. David returned to Jerusalem and punished the rebels. There were no more threats to his throne, but after Absalom's rebellion and death, the king began to feel old and tired, and the people began to ask which of David's sons would be the next king of Israel. Okay, that was about David today. Now, I did find a few little fun facts. Let's see. Okay. First one. The longest word in the Bible is 18 letters long. Okay. It is Maher Shalal Hashbaz. And according to you can find it in Isaiah chapter 8 verse 1. It refers to the symbolic name that Isaiah was commanded to write on a tablet to indicate a future attack on Damascus and Samaria by the king of Assyria. Okay. It says you can keep a mini Bible on you at all times. Not really, but it's a teeny tiny dot that's no larger than the tip of a ballpoint pen. And according to the Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs, scientists at the Technical Israel Institute of Technology in Haifa managed to place a 1.2 million letters of the Old Testament onto this miniature silicone disc. However, you'll have to magnify the font. It says about 10,000 times to read the contents. And it says if you're interested in seeing this famous mini Bible, it's on display at the Israel Museum. And talking about the Bible, the most expensive Bible in the world, the Gutenberg Bible, was the first edition to be produced with a movable type printer through the 1450s. A copy sold to Japanese bookseller Maruzen Co. Ltd. for a whopping $5.4 million, and to this day it holds the record for the most expensive Bible ever sold. The shortest book in the Bible can be found in Psalm chapter 117, which is 2 verses, and I will read them to you. "Oh, praise the Lord, all ye nations, praise him, all ye people. For his merciful kindness is great toward us, and the truth of the Lord endureth forever. Praise ye the Lord." And that was our lesson and fun facts for this week. I don't believe I have ever done one this long. It was a lot of information on David, but I wanted to go ahead and do it while we were at it. I love you all. Happy 4th of July. Have a safe weekend. Have a good weekend. And I will see y'all next week. Love you. Bye.